Hello, welcome to this mini lecture on Romeo and Juliet for Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences. This is for the course Culture and Literature 2, Introduction to British Culture and Literature. The learning outcomes for this class are going to be we're going to analyze and interpret drama in both written and spoken form by identifying, explicating, and responding to the key themes and elements in Shakespearean dramas as presented in both written and spoken form. And essentially, this is going to be broken down into 4 parts. Part 1 and Part 2, you're going to partially see on this web lecture. We're going to begin with an analysis of the text, and we're then going to move on to the literary themes, or essentially what literary themes are. We're then going to discuss that in class, the literary themes, plus the discussion itself, and we're going to introduce the 1996 film, and you're going to work on this film with your fellow students in an online group discussion. There are a few questions that are part of this mini lecture that you will have to answer, and make sure that you have those ready for the discussion that will take place in class, which will be digital this year because of the COVID-19 crisis. So we're going to start with part 1, which is an analysis. And as you can see here, this is a photo of the beautiful city of Verona in Italy, which is where the play takes place. Now, if we look at Act 1, Scene 1, we're introduced to 2 households that are both alike in dignity in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. Shakespeare begins by telling us exactly what's going to happen in this play. He writes that from ancient grudge breaks new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean, and from forth the loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. So in the first few couplets, first few verses of the play, we're already told that it takes place in Verona. There's an ancient grudge. There's hatred between 2 families. People are going to be killed, and in the end, the 2 lovers are going to kill themselves. And the story is based upon 2 families, Juliet's family, the Capulets, and Romeo's family, the Montague. In Act 1, Scene 1, the play starts with a fight between the 2 households. We enter with 4 servants talking about how they hate each other. And the play escalates when Benvolio, who is from the Montague family, Romeo's family, enters and tries to keep the peace. Eventually, Tybalt, a Capulet, and Benvolio fight, but they're interrupted by the prince, who stops the brawl. And essentially, this is one of the major roles that the prince has. He keeps the peace. And this is something that's actually quite typical of Shakespearean drama. A lot of times, the royalty, the royal household, the prince, the king, is the person who keeps the peace amongst the petty squabblings of the aristocrats. Benvolio promises when he sees to see why Romeo has been so absent. Benvolio then finds out that Romeo is in love with Rosaline, who does not love him in return. And there are really 2 ways to look at Romeo's love for Rosaline right now at this part in the play. And we'll come back to this several times. Is he the type of guy who fleetingly falls in love with whomever, or is he truly in love? You have to question the fact that you know that Romeo will fall in love with Juliet very shortly, whether or not this is true love or just fake love. Now, in Scene 2 and in Scene 3, Paris goes to Lord Capulet to ask him for Juliet's hand in marriage. Juliet's father thinks that she's too young. He says, "But saying over what I have said before, my child is yet a stranger to the world. She hath not seen change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, or we may think her right to be a bride." And Paris then replies, "Younger than she, our happy mother's maid." And this is quite strange because we see here that Juliet is only 13 years old, so she's extremely young, and that her father agrees with this. Her father thinks, no, she's way too young to get married. We have to have at least another 2 years. 15 years old, then she'll be ready to be married. In Scene 3, Lady Capulet and the nurse try to convince Juliet that she should fall in love with Paris, and this is all in preparation of a large party that's about to take place. Now, when we move on to Scene 4, we get Mercutio. Mercutio is neither a Capulet nor a Montague. He's actually a relative of the prince. And there are 2 main characters that we're going to see that are relatives of the prince. That is Paris. So, of course, we know if Juliet marries Paris, she's going to be moving up in society. He's part of the prince's family. And we have Mercutio. Now, Mercutio wants to go to the party, but Romeo's had a bad dream. And we get this famous speech that Mercutio gives called the Queen Mab speech. And the Queen Mab is described as a miniature character who performs midnight pranks on sleepers. Driven by little fairies, she rides her chariot over the noses of the sleeping and delivers the fancies of sleeping men. You almost get the feeling here that Mercutio is poking fun at Romeo. He's acting like Romeo is being overly dramatic. He wants to go to the party, and Romeo is just being a drudge. Not I, believe me, you have dancing shoes with nimble soles. I have a soul of lead, so stakes me to the ground I cannot move. So you can see here Romeo's actually being quite dramatic. He's saying, you can go, you can dance, you can go and have fun, but me, I have a soul of lead. I'm totally depressed about this Rosaline. I can't go. And of course, they eventually get him to go. So if we take a moment here, we have to look at the plot in Act 1. Up until now, there's been a gradual build up to this party. Everyone is planning for this party. And the party is definitely the crescendo of the first act. It's definitely the most important part. So when we get to Act 1, Scene 5, several things are happening at this party. The first one is that Romeo meets Juliet, and he instantly forgets about Rosaline, who he was depressed about only a few minutes earlier. He says, the measure done, I'll watch her place of stand, and touching hers make a blessed my rude hand. Did my heart love till now, forswear its sight? For I never saw true beauty till this night. Which is quite ironic if we consider the way that he was looking at Rosaline. We then have Juliet coming in. She often realizes that she's in love with this guy. She sends the nurse to figure out who he is. And the nurse comes back and says, this is Romeo. This is from the family that you're supposed to hate. And so Juliet realizes, and also Romeo realizes, that she's fallen in love with someone who she's intended to hate. She's fallen in love with her father's enemy. Juliet says, my only love sprung from my only hate. Too early seen unknown, and known too late. Prodigious birth of love it is to me, that I must love a loathed enemy. Another thing happens in this scene, and that is that we have Tybalt realizing that Romeo is there, and Lord Capulet refusing to allow him to fight Romeo. So Tybalt is still upset about what happened in Act 1, Scene 1, and he sees Romeo, and Lord Capulet is trying to keep the stop from turning to kind of stop this petty feud. He even compliments what is going to be his future son-in-law. Tybalt says, this by his voice should be a Montague. Fetch me, Ray, rapier boy. What dares the slave come hither covered with an antic face, to fleer and scorn at our solemnity? Now by the stock and honor of my kin, to strike him dead, I hold it not a sin. And Lord Capulet replies, content thee, gentle coz, let him alone. He bears him like a portly gentleman, and to say truth, Verona brags of him, to be a virtuous governed and well governed of youth. We then go on to Act 2, Scene 2, and in Act 2, Scene 2, Romeo disappears from Mercutio and Tybalt. And there's a soliloquy that is going to begin with Romeo and Juliet, and this is our famous balcony scene. Now, I'm going to stop for a second and explain what a soliloquy is. A soliloquy is a device in place where characters talk to themselves, often reveal deep feelings that they have at the time. And we see this a lot in both plays and films, and it's very unnatural in normal speech, because if we have long discussions with ourselves while we're alone, we may do that every once in a while, but in plays they're essential. We don't see it as being strange. It's because it allows us to know the inner understandings of a character. Now, if we're reading a novel, we can get the thoughts of a character on the page, and we understand that those are thoughts. But in a play, this is, of course, difficult. So the soliloquy is actually a handy tool. And this is the most famous one that we have. It's the one that a lot of people memorize, especially people who've had to read this from high school. And this is Juliet thinking about Romeo. And she says, O Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name? Or, if thou wilt not, Be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. So at this point, after only knowing each other for one evening, they agree to get married. And when we have Act 2, Scene 2, we then have the entrance of Friar Lawrence. So Romeo wants to get married, and Friar Lawrence says to him, Holy St. Francis, what a change is here! Is Rosaline, that thou didst love so dear, so soon forsaken? Young's men love lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. Later he says, Thou in these woes were all for Rosaline. And thou art changed, pronounce this sentence then, women may fall when there's no strength in men. And this has to do, of course, with Friar Lawrence. Romeo comes to him, he says, hey, I really want you to help me get married to Juliet. And Romeo is pleading for Friar Lawrence, please allow us to get married. Our parents won't be there. This is going to be a secretive marriage. And Friar Lawrence is, of course, poking at this idea of their love. We can see this because Romeo says, thou child'st me oft for loving Rosaline. Friar Lawrence says, for doting, not for loving, pupil mine. Romeo, and baddest may bury love. Friar Lawrence, not in grave, to lay one in, another out to have. And Romeo responds, I pray thee chide not, her I love now, doth grace for grace and love for love allow. The other did not so. Eventually, Friar Lawrence is persuaded and he allows the marriage to go through. But this is something that we have to think about. So the first question that you're going to answer is, what does Friar Lawrence actually think of Romeo and Juliet and their love? Why does he agree to marry the two? I want you to use two quotes from the last scene to describe why you think that Friar Lawrence is going to allow this marriage to take place. Make sure to have this question prepared because you're going to need it in the next lecture. We then have Act 2, Scenes 4, 5, and 6. And in Act 2, Scene 4, Romeo meets with Mercutio and Benvolio, and the nurse visits him and he tries to pay her to bring Juliet to the wedding. She, of course, refuses. And in Act 2, Scene 5, the nurse tells Juliet to go to the Friar Lawrence for confession, which she has to do before she's allowed to be wed. And in Act 2, Scene 6, Juliet goes to Friar Lawrence and they prepare to be married. They become married then at this point. We then move on to Act 3, Scene 1, and Mercutio is killed. And this is actually one of the largest scenes because he begins with this idea of the plague or the hatred of both your houses. He says, no, 'tis not so deep a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough 'twill serve. Ask me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. I am peppered. I warrant for this world a plague of both your houses. Sounds a dog, a rat, a mouse, a cat to scratch a man to death, a braggart, a rogue, a villain that fights the book of arithmetic. Why the devil came you between us? I was hurt under your arm. Romeo kills Tybalt, and Romeo is exiled by the prince. The next scene is Act 3, Scenes 2, 3, and 4, and in Act 3, Scene 2, Juliet learns that Romeo killed her cousin and that Romeo has been banished. She has issues with this, but she eventually decides to choose for her husband over her family. She says, shall I speak ill of him that is my husband? Ah, poor lord of mine, what tongue shall smooth thy name, when I, thy 3 hours' wife, have mangled it? But wherefore, villain, didst thou kill my cousin? That villain cousin would have killed my husband. Back, foolish tears, back to your native spring. Your tributary drops belong to woe, which you mistakenly offer up to joy. My husband lives, that Tybalt would have slain, and Tybalt's dead, that would have slain my husband. All this is comfort, wherefore weep I then. In Act 3, Scene 3, Romeo says to the friar that he has to leave, that he has been exiled to Mantua, and he's discussing this. And he gets a ring from the nurse, and they plan for both of them to move to Mantua. So in Act 3, Scene 3, Romeo says, there is no world without Verona walls, but purgatory, torture, hell itself. Hence banished is a banished from this world, and the world's exile is death, and banished is death mistermed. Calling death banishment, thou cuttest my head off with a golden axe, and smilest upon the stroke that murders me. And in Act 3, Scene 4, Paris and Lord Capulet discuss Paris's marriage to Juliet. They both agree that Juliet is going to get married on Thursday. Then we get to the Act 3, Scene 5. Juliet has a weird premonition when she looks at Romeo that he is about to leave. They are interrupted by Lady Capulets. They spend the night together, and when they wake, we then get Juliet says that she's going to refuse to marry Paris. Lord Capulet then threatens her, and you'll be mine, I'll give you to my friend, and you be not, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. For by my soul I'll never acknowledge thee, nor what is mine shall never be thee good. Trust to thou, think thou, I'll not be forsworn. The nurse tries to make things better and eventually tries to convince Juliet to marry the young Paris. In Act 4, Scene 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we then have essentially Friar Lawrence's plan. Juliet's supposed to go home and take the potion. She will appear to be dead. Friar Lawrence tells her, no warmth, no breath shall testify thou livest. The roses in thy lips and cheeks shall fade to paly ashes. Thy eyes' windows fall like death when he shuts up the day of life. Each part deprived of supple government shall stiff and stark and cold appear like death. And in this borrowed likeness of shrunken death thou shalt continue 42 hours, and then awake as from a pleasant sleep. Now, when the bridegroom in the morning comes to rouse thee from thy bed, there art thou dead. The plan is that Lawrence is going to give Juliet this potion. She's going to take it and will appear like she's dead. She'll be buried in the tomb, and Romeo will come and get her. Friar Lawrence is going to send a friar to Mantua to tell Romeo where he's supposed to meet her. Juliet bids her mother farewell, and Juliet says to her, God knows when we will meet again. Juliet is killed. This is a shock to the family, and she's buried. So, the second question that I want you to answer is, what makes this plan to save Romeo and Juliet exciting? What is the link with the knowledge the viewer has from the prologue, namely that two star-crossed lovers take their life? Think about this. The audience, including you, everyone knows that Juliet and Romeo are both going to kill themselves. So what about the friar's plan makes this kind of the important part of the plot, especially enough to almost dedicate an entire act to it? We then get to Act 5. And in Act 5, Balthazar visits Romeo and tells him that Juliet's been killed. Romeo says, well, Juliet, I will lie with thee tonight. Romeo goes to an apothecary in Mantua to get poison to kill himself. Funny enough, at this time, he also knows that this is going to be a punishable offense. Then in Act 5, Scene 2, Friar Lawrence learns from Friar John that the letter was not sent to Romeo. Friar Lawrence is aware that these things are amiss, and he says, now must I to monument alone within 3 hours will fair Juliet wake. She will beshrew me much that Romeo hath not no notice of these accidents. But I will write again to Mantua, and keep her at my cell till Romeo comes, poor living corpse, closed in a dead man's tomb. Then we get to our culmination of the story, Act 5, Scene 3. It begins with Romeo and Paris both meeting at the grave. Romeo is trying to get in, and Romeo and Paris fight. Eventually, Paris is killed. Romeo enters, and he sees Juliet, and he takes his poison. Before then, he has this very long soliloquy where he sees the other people that have recently been killed in it. And he goes there, and he speaks to Juliet, and he says, with worms that are thy chambermaids, O here will I set at my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. Eyes, look your last. Arms, take your last embrace, and lips, O you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss, a dateless bargain to engrossing death. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavory guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks, thy seasick, weary bark. Here's to my love. O true apothecary, thy drugs are quick. Thus with a kiss I die. Romeo enters, he takes the poison, and he kills. He is killed. Friar Lawrence tries to get Juliet to leave, but she refuses. Juliet then kills herself. She does this first by kissing Romeo, and then she says, "Yes, noise, then I'll be brief. O happy dagger, this is thy sheath. There rust, and let me die." She stabs herself and falls on Romeo's body. Then at the end we have the final. The prince once intervenes. And the prince first talks about his own kinsman's death, Mercutio in Paris. He says, "This letter doth make good the friar's words, their course of love, the tidings of their death. And here he writes that he did buy a poison. Oh, a poor apothecary, and therewithal came to this vault to die and lie with Juliet. Where be these enemies, Capulet, Montague? See what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love, and I, for winking at your discords too, have lost a brace of kinmen. All are punished." And then he ends the play almost in a true Shakespearean form, this royal highness who's always above the squandering of the people. He says, "A glooming peace this morning with it brings. The sun, for sorrow, will not show its head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned, and some punished. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." Now, the third question that you're going to ask is in Act 5 leaves us with one question. Does love win or does love lose in this story? And I want you to use quotes from the play to prove your answer. So you have to think about, it's a story about love, but is it that love wins? Does that love eventually kill everyone? Is it a true love story? What does the story say about love? And that brings us to part 2, which is we're going to talk about what a literary theme is. So I want to remind you of something that we discussed in Literature 1, which is that a theme is a central topic that a text treats. Themes can be divided essentially into 2 categories. The first one is a work's thematic concept, and this is what readers think the work is about. The second is a thematic statement. That means what the work says about the subject. So you're going to have to consider these 2 aspects. So what the thematic concept is, so what you think that the text is about. So you can say the text is about love, the text is about family. You can also say a thematic statement. What does Romeo and Juliet say about love? Whether love wins, what love is like, what family is like, what hatred is like, etc. And this is what we're going to cover in our next lecture. Now, thank you for listening. This is, of course, half of the lecture. Make sure that you're available to complete the in-class part and make sure that the questions have been answered. Thanks.